From the historic campus of Hillsdale College in Hillsdale, Michigan, where the good, the true, and the beautiful are taught, nurtured, and honored, this is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, bringing the activity and education of the college to listeners across the country.
These people are not Democrats who want to play within sidelines, the parameters of normal politics. It's not that they have a porous border. These people don't believe in a border. It's not that they are deficit spenders. They believe in modern monetary theory, that there's no problem with printing money, and they think it's good. These people do. It's not that they've lost deterrence. They are openly siding with the enemies of Israel.
This is your host, Scot Bertram. Welcome to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. That was Dr. Victor Davis Hanson, Senior Fellow in Military History and Classics at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. Also, Wayne and Marcia Buske, Distinguished Fellow in History here at Hillsdale College. His 2020 book, The Case for Trump, is now re-released in a 2024 edition with a new preface, The Premature Obituary of Donald Trump. We talk in depth with Dr. Hanson about the book and the preface on today's program. Dr. Hanson, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So why did you feel the need to re-release The Case for Trump, a book that was released in 2020 in front of that presidential election? 4 years later, what makes The Case for Trump still relevant?
I wanted to explain to people how someone, say on January 7th of 2020, was written off as an inert ex-president that would have zero chance ever re-entering the political fray. How in less than 2 years, he made the most amazing political comeback since Richard Nixon. And that was partly because his primary rivals in the Republican Party turned out to be less charismatic or less likable or less dynamic than he was, partly because the left chose to wage lawfare against him, whether manifested in those 5 civil or criminal suits, or trying to get his name off the ballot that gave him sympathy. And then third, and most importantly, Joe Biden, who had run on a unity, old Joe Biden from Scranton moderate veneer, turned out to really outsource his administration to sort of an Obama hard left third term. And after the Afghanistan debacle, the Chinese balloon debacle, the Ukrainian and Gazan wars, hyperinflation, crime, open border, 10 million illegal aliens, people began to look not at Trump's tweets or his nadir on January 6th, but his record. And all those factors together explain why he really is, even if he were to lose, he still waged the most impressive comeback since Richard Nixon.
The preface on the new release of The Case for Trump is titled The Premature Obituary of Donald Trump, and I think we'll spend most of our time talking about that. It's around 50 pages, new pages on the front of this new The Case for Trump. You begin by reminding us that in this book, you chart Trump as a modern version of a classical tragic hero, at odds with the world they want to defend, with a fatal flaw, someone who cannot control an appetite or arrogance, ego, hubris. I'm reading this, Dr. Hanson, and in the back of my mind, I'm thinking of another recent president who might have been described as someone who could not control appetites, arrogance, ego. That's Bill Clinton. I had not put the two of them together. Is there more than a little Bill Clinton, perhaps, in Donald Trump? And if there were a D after Donald Trump's name, might he be celebrated the way that Bill Clinton was by the mainstream media?
There is in their character and their behavior, but what separates them is Bill Clinton was the consummate insider. He really was the first one in the Democratic Party to say, we're the party of Silicon Valley, Wall Street. The big money is now with us. Hollywood is now with the media fused with us. And we've got the best political consultants. And we're going to draw on all of my and my wife's insider administrative state contacts. That carried over to Hillary Clinton's campaign, as you saw in 2016. scheme. But Trump came in with even the people in his own party, the McCain wing, the Bush wing, the Romney wing, disliking him as much as the Democratic Party. So all of the pundits on the right side, almost all of them, George Will, Bill Kristol, David Frum, Charles Sykes, Jonah Goldberg, the whole hierarchy of National Review almost, they almost, in their dislike of Trump, they almost, and I shouldn't say almost, they did refute 3 decades or 4 decades of conservatism, and have now either become anti-conservatives or democratic liberals. So he was completely orphaned from any establishment, New York, Washington corridor support. And so he was more like a Shane or the Magnificent Seven. He was an outsider who came in with the promise that he had these certain skill sets that the establishment had either lost or never had. And on terms of the border or foreign policy or crime or conservative values, he could fix things. But I don't think he understood that the methodologies that he used or the language that he embraced, it was kind of in a doom loop, that the more successful he became at solving these problems, and he had a wonderful record for 4 years, the more that gave a margin of error to even his supporters to say, well, he tweaks too much, or he engages in personal animosity or slurs, or not in my name, don't do that. And so in 2000, for a variety of reasons, he wrote off into the sunset. And now the question is it a Hollywood remake where the guy comes back, or is he done? But if you're going to come back into the small town and go after the cattle barons again and say, I'm a gunslinger, you need me again, or will they say, no, last time you embarrassed us that we ever had to resort to you?
Will he come back? That's a question we'll get to in a moment. The case for Trump, this preface from Dr. Victor Davis Hanson, begins essentially after Election Day in 2020 and in January of 2021, post January 6th, the inauguration. There's a lot of things happening to Donald Trump during this period. And in some ways, some people certainly would have counted him out. Was there a clear low point for Donald Trump during this period?
Yeah, I try to rely on the polls, and that was essentially for the month of January all the way into February, March, and April. You even saw it on Fox News or Newsmax that really staunch supporters of Trump were starting to invite guests on or starting to editorialize that maybe you could have this successful MAGA agenda without Trump. And I think he said to someone that you couldn't have sunlight without the sun. He was aware of it. And at one point last year in early summer, DeSantis was about 9 points ahead of Donald Trump. And that actually went all the way into this year, into January, where he had a slight lead before the primaries. And then the culmination of Fannie Willis, Alvin Bragg, Jack Smith, Letitia James, E. Jean Carroll, boomeranged on the left, but it also boomeranged on Haley and DeSantis, because they never quite figured out if it was possible to figure out how to square that circle of deploring probably the illegal or at least amoral use of the judicial system to go after a political candidate, and then criticizing that as they must, but then that criticism leading to empathy for Donald Trump. So they were in a lose-lose situation. If they attacked the left-wing's use of this illegitimate type of lawfare, then they were aiding Trump. But if they deplored what Trump had done and say that he got what he deserved, then they were betraying the Republican Party or the MAGA cause. So they came up with kind of an anemic, well, what they're doing is horrible to Donald Trump, but I wouldn't have ever made myself vulnerable because I have a character that's unlike Trump and doesn't lend itself to exposure to what they're capable of. And that didn't sell in the primary.
Over those years of the Biden term, everything seems to point back to the Afghanistan withdrawal, this failed, just chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan. That's when, if you look back on polling, things start to head in the opposite direction. That seems to be when people lost faith and confidence in Joe Biden as commander-in-chief. As you look back and knowing what we know now, do you think that largely is a product of Joe Biden's leadership, Joe Biden's skills, or even then, was he simply incapable of doing the job?
Yeah, I think until that point, there were indications that the Biden administration was in disarray in terms of foreign policy, and it had weaknesses. We saw Anthony Blinken and Jake Scott humiliated in Anchorage by the Chinese in March. Mm-hmm. We saw that Joe Biden had said to Vladimir Putin, if you're going to engage in cyber warfare, kind of lay off certain institutions that should be off target. So there were indications, but nobody had ever seen a humiliation like that before, where we left $50 billion in munitions. We left our allies, we left contractors, we left $1 billion embassy, we left a defensible $300 million outfitted, refitted airbase. And just the images of all those Humvees and trucks lined up. And unfortunately for Biden, this started to coincide with the fact that we were coming out slowly from COVID. He was in the process of spending trillions of dollars we didn't have. The supply chains were still inert from COVID. And he did the worst of all possible things possible. He took a population that had loose cash from the Trump stimulus and had not had anywhere to spend it and were flush with cash and few supplies for which were available for this cash. And then he added more cash, and that started the hyperinflation. But when you look at his approval rating, they really didn't go below 50% until the Afghanistan fiasco. Mm-hmm. And that was the turning point. I don't know, given that, I don't know why Trump, for example, gets into these detours about Governor Kemp or the prior DNA claims of Kamala Harris, when he could just simply say, you have any idea what they did in Afghanistan? Mm-hmm. They want to buy back or force you to give up your weapons. But they gave 400,000 assault weapons to the Taliban, 70,000 machine guns to them. You can't afford a new truck. They've gone up 20,000. They turned over 70,000 new trucks. And I don't mean heavy trucks, 8,000 in, but pickups and Humvees. And they gave them to these terrorists. That would be a winning argument. Even today, people are outraged at that. But that, you're right, that was the point where he never got back to 50% approval rate.
Dr. Victor Davis Hanson with us, the book, The Case for Trump, 2024 edition. You had mentioned earlier, as we talked about Donald Trump's low points, his challengers during this time, when it looked like he was very vulnerable, if in fact he had an idea about running again for the Republican nomination, whether that was Ron DeSantis or Nikki Haley or others. What they were saying, boiled down, as you say, is Trump had the right message, but from this point forward, he's just simply the wrong messenger. And some, like Governor DeSantis, even had a great track record as governor of Florida to point to of accomplishments. Why did that message end up failing?
It ended up failing partly because of what Haley and DeSantis did as candidates, but they had an unfortunate series of events from their point of view. Very fortunate in Trump. And again, that was the total collapse of the facade that Joe Biden, he was old Joe Biden from Scranton, and he was a centrist, because as they started the campaign, the borders were open. We had 2 or 3 million people coming across. We had the administration saying that Border Patrol people were like slave owners whipping people, or they were creating Auschwitz-like camps. It was just crazy. And then, of course, we had this whole woke obsession And then we had the Ukraine war, and then what would later become the Gaza war. So Trump was saying, I have a record at a presidential level. Look at it, and then look at what this president did. And that was hard he was almost running as an incumbent. And then, as I said earlier, no one in their right mind thought that the left would really pull the trigger, so to speak, and start going into Mar-a-Lago with the SWAT team and then rearranging files on the floor to make it look like it was sloppier than it really was, or contrasting out with what Joe Biden had done with more files for a longer period of time, less secure places, multiple locations. So people said, this is an outrage, this asymmetrical. Nobody's ever tried to take a candidate off the ballot. This is crazy. And they were saying, yes, it's crazy, but Donald Trump, he exposed himself. And then people said, no. They would go after you if you were in this situation. So they were in a loser situation. So they ended up half-heartedly empathizing with Trump and half-heartedly condemning the use of lawfare. But meanwhile, Trump was barnstorming the country and said, it's not about me. These people are evil. They're trying to destroy democracy. They're going after me. Look what they're doing. And that really appealed to people. They said, you know what? He's our attack dog. He's our pit bull. We'll cut the leash. He may bite people on the periphery, but we'll point him in the right direction. The others just don't have that. And then finally, to be frank, DeSantis had a wonderful record. He came off a smashing victory when other candidates had not done well in the midterms. But the more he got out, the more he seemed like a technocrat. He didn't have the spontaneity or the charisma that people had thought he would have at a national level, given his success in Florida. And Haley, the more Haley was not able to gain traction, the more she became ad hominem and personal about Trump's age, about his possible dementia, he was forgetting words. And she turned out to be very personal and nasty. And that was the wrong tack to take, I think.
Dr. Hanson, much of the preface also deals with the continued lawfare from the left against Donald Trump and the timing of this. So many of these cases, so many of these actions seemed timed to land in 2024 when they had years earlier to move forward. It seemed to be an intentional strategy, but did it backfire on the left?
They had 2 years that they could have filed, whether it was Fannie Willis or Bragg or Letitia James, because all of these alleged crimes, whether it was the non-disclosure with Stormy Daniels or the real estate assessments with Letitia James or the phone call in 2020 in Georgia, they didn't have to be focused on 2023. In fact, the evidence was even more stale. They could have gone right after Trump in 2021, but the idea was that they were going to focus on him in the campaign cycle and then disqualify him. And that it does reveal that they still thought he would be a more formidable candidate than a DeSantis or Haley. Well, many people told the Democrats, what are you doing? You want Trump. He's the controversial person. And all you're doing is giving him empathy and sort of lessening the opportunities of Haley and DeSantis. And they didn't listen. And people just said, you know what? I'm sick and tired of the two-tier system of justice. We know that these charges would never have been filed had Trump been a man of the left, or had he said he was not going to run for president again. We know that Fannie Willis and Ann Bragg and Peter James had run on promises to get Trump in advance of their indictments. We knew that Jack Smith had a really bad record going after Bob McConnell in Virginia, the Republican governor who was completely exonerated from Smith's indictment and kind of loaded conviction. And we know that E. Jean Carroll was kind of a preposterous civil suit with a biased judge and was funded by a Silicon Valley left-wing billionaire. So he put all that together, and most people on the conservative side said this is just a farce, and Donald Trump is a victim. And he was very clever in advancing that narrative.
We'll continue our conversation with Dr. Victor Davis Hanson in just a moment. His new book, The Case for Trump, 2024 edition. I want to take a moment to invite you to sign up for our new free online documentary course, Marxism, Socialism, and Communism. If you can believe it, after more than 100 years of failed experiments, some still think socialism holds the keys to utopia. In this new free online documentary course, you'll learn about the political and economic implications of Marxism, and you can pre-register now at hillsdale.edu/new course for Marxism, Socialism, and Communism. Inside, a group of Hillsdale professors walk you through the origins of Marxist thought, its impact on the 20th century, and the dangers it poses to human flourishing. To enroll today and secure your spot in this completely free online documentary course, I want you to visit hillsdale.edu/new course. NEWCOURSE. That's hillsdale.edu/new course for Marxism, Socialism, and Communism, the new free online documentary course from Hillsdale College. Returning now to Dr. Victor Davis Hanson, The Case for Trump is the new book, 2024 edition, with a brand new preface. Dr. Hanson, as we look forward a bit, Dr. Hanson, to 2024, something that I looked at the Trump campaign and worried about was who was running the campaign at this point? Who are his advisors? He ran through a number of people in 2016 and a number of people in 2020. And I worried who was left to guide him and to guide the campaign. And you make the point in the preface, and I would agree, more sober and more astute political advisors on the Trump team in 2023 and now into 2024. How do you think that all came together for him?
Well, I think people in his family had told him that some of his own problems had come from people who had either not been. There were two problems with Trump. One was people did not want to work with him, and then therefore he had enlisted people on the Republican or maybe the conservative Democratic side that really didn't like him, but he thought they were marquee names. So he brought in Kelly and Mattis and Steve Mnuchin and people like that were not ideologically Rex Tillerson. And then we had Anonymous, and they either meet or they weren't on board, or in some cases they actively opposed Trump. And that Comey, et cetera, Fauci, and that really hurt him. And then second, he had advisors or people who were indiscreet. So he had Scaramucci, and he had Bannon, and he had Omarosa, and all these peripheral characters. And the net result was chaotic. So people came to him and said, Susan Wiles, Mr. DeSantis, she's got sober, there's Chung, there's these other people. Gavin Nunes is running Truth Social. He's an advisor. These people are professionals. And they have done a very good job the way they handled all of these lawfare cases. And except for his long and kind of monotonous speech at the convention up until that point, and even after that point, despite that drawback of that speech, he was still headed toward a landslide against Biden. I think they were caught surprised because they just really didn't think the Democrats would be that brazen to go, for a year saying anybody who questions Biden's mental cognitive status is engaging in a cheap fake, shame on you, and 24 hours later saying it's worse than you thought. He's unable to continue, at least as our candidate, but he is going to continue as your president. And then we're going to select a woman that never had one delegate, Kamala Harris, whom they had prior 24 hours before said, we can't get rid of Biden because she's incapable of being a presidential candidate. So all those machinations within a 48 or 72-hour period shocked the Trump campaign. And I think it got them off base, and they're only slowly recovering. And to the degree that Trump can discipline himself and not go after fellow Republicans and nurse old wounds, or not replay 2020, or not get into the DEI, woke, racial, gender ambush territory, and just concentrate that these are the two most left candidates we've ever seen, Walz and Harris. He's got a good chance of winning. But that's going to require nonstop discipline for 90 days and focus on what they are, what they say, what the record was, what they plan to do, and to expose this effort on their part to create a facade of moderation. And that's the task they have right now. I think their advisors know it, but Donald Trump has a tendency to go off topic and nurse old wounds, and that's exactly what the left wants.
The Trump campaign was very disciplined while Joe Biden was melting down and eventually losing his place on the ticket. So there is that possibility. You talk in the preface about the very culture of the United States at risk through anti-Semitism on the left, crime in our big cities, race relations worsening, DEI, many of those things you just talked about. You say the civilizational bedlam is not sustainable. People feel this. Would you recommend this tack for the Trump campaign? The idea that while the left wants Trump to be made out to be the chaos candidate, the person who is unreliable and who knows what he's going to do, that in fact the Harris-Walz ticket, those are the chaos candidates. Those who are contributing, who are contributing to the tearing down of the very culture of the country.
Yes, and you can see two things to prove your point. One is, at least for the month of June and May, the message of the Trump campaign was common sense. Donald Trump has common sense. He's not crazy. And then second, the left always projects their vulnerabilities onto their opponent. So they came up with these talking points of weird. Well, I mean, if you look at the Easter parade, transgender person exposing his breast at the White House, or you look at some of the appointments, the nuclear energy specialists who steal women's clothing in the carousels at they are a weird party, but they projected that onto Trump because they were worried about that. And to the extent that they can say, these people are not Democrats who want to play within sidelines, the parameters of normal politics. It's not that they have a porous border. These people don't believe in a border. It's not that they are deficit spenders. They believe in modern monetary theory, that there's no problem with printing money, and they think it's good. These people do. It's not that they've lost deterrence. They are openly siding with the enemies of Israel. And if they can make that argument that these are people who are nihilists and don't really like the traditions and histories and customs of the United States as they see it, and they're French revolutionaries. They want a holistic revolution that involves gender, that involves abortion, that involves what is in the school curriculum for 5-year-olds, that it's a totalitarian nihilistic agenda. They'll win. But again, they were very brilliant because they dropped this ticket at a very late date, and they coronated someone who's never won a primary or delegate. And she was very mum as vice president. She had certain disastrous roles to play. But they have a paradigm that worked in 2020, and that is, if a candidate can't speak extemporaneously and will embarrass himself or herself, keep him in the basement. Outsource the campaign to the media and the big donors. Count on 70% of the electorate not voting on election day in the swing states, and create a facade, whether it's old Joe Biden from Scranton or Kamala Harris retracting all of their left-wing prior stances to show that they're the party of moderation, at least until the election. And that worked in 2020, and it's the task of the Trump campaign to get her out and have as many debates as possible, make her talk extemporaneously, put pressure on her to give interviews, and expose this moderate facade is bogus. It's just counterfeit, and crack it and break it. But again, there's not a lot of time to do that.
Victor Davis Hanson with us. The 2024 edition of The Case for Trump is now available. That leads me perfectly into my final question, which you've already addressed in some way. But there is this debate about the debates now, ABC, Fox, what date it might be. It sounds to me like you would recommend to President Trump and his team that you would want him to agree to a debate, perhaps on terms that are not seemingly favorable to him, for the opportunity to exploit Kamala Harris the same way he exploited Joe Biden in their debate.
Yeah, I think she has the same, there's a different causation, but she has the same inability to speak for different reasons. So what he needs to do is, they're fighting ABC versus Fox. All he has to do is say, and be magnanimous as a statesman. He said, let's not quibble. The American people need to hear our views. You want this to be exclusively on ABC. I want it to be on Fox. Let's do both. We'll do yours first, ABC, and then I'll do Fox. And we'll go according to your rules, and then we'll go according to my rules. We'll compromise. And I don't think she'll take that unless she has a precipitous fall in the polls. And just to finish, there is a model, and I've written about it, so has James Pearson, that people forget that when Michael Dukakis in 1988 came out of that convention, the first week of August, analogous to where we are now, he was ahead of George H.W. Bush by 17 points.
Yeah.
And he was declared the winner in a lot of media. And he ran as a technocrat, and he said, I'm about competence, not ideology, even though he was the most left-wing governor in Massachusetts history. And he said, I'm competent. And they didn't know what to do for a while. Then they unleashed this brilliant but very tough Lee Atwater. In a series of ads, he redefined him. Willie Horton ad, Boston Harbor ad, the Tank ad, et cetera, et cetera. And then they went after him, and they said they didn't do it personally. And Dukakis was a much better spoken and much better candidate than Harris. But by September, October, it was even, and as they got into late October, Bush was ahead and he won by 8 points. And just simply, they cracked that facade and said, if you vote for this person, he'll do to the United States what he's doing to Massachusetts. And they need to say, if you elect these two, they'll do what Minnesota's like now and California's like now will be the United States, and there won't be anywhere to go. So that's the task they have. But the problem, I think, is that was the last time they won 51% of the popular vote. And after Lee Atwater accomplished that, and then he died not long afterwards from a brain tumor, the Bush, McCain, Romney, Bob Dole paradigm was, we'll never employ those methodology again. That's beneath us. We're the party of the aristocratic East Coast culture, and we're just not going to do that. It's beneath us, and they lost. And Bill Clinton and Gore and Obama had no such reservation. So they need to go back to, if they want to win, they got to get rid of this pretense that they'd rather lose nobly than win ugly.
Victor Davis Hanson, the author of The Case for Trump 2024 edition, available now with the new preface, The Premature Obituary of Donald Trump. Dr. Victor Davis Hanson, thanks so much for joining us here on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Thank you for having me again.
Up next, we hear excerpts from a recent Hillsdale lecture given by former Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich. I'm Scot Bertram. This is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Hey there! Today I want to tell you about the Hillsdale K-12 Classical Education Podcast. This unique show explains how children benefit from an American classical education. Whether you're a teacher, student, or parent, you'll find something of value on the show. You'll hear from teachers and administrators from schools around the country, as well as Hillsdale professors and friends who are leading the effort to revive the American tradition of K-12 education. When you listen, you'll learn all about classical education, what it is, how to teach it, and why it matters today. And there are dozens of back episodes on specific topics, like teaching Singapore math, reading great books, and even understanding how athletics is critical to a child's development. Listen every Monday on podcast.hillsdale.edu. That's podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you find your audio.
Welcome back to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. I'm Scot Bertram. Find us on X for updated show and guest information. We're at Hillsdale Radio. We hear excerpts now from a recent lecture for Hillsdale College given by Newt Gingrich, the former Speaker of the House. It's titled What to Do About the DOJ, and it was delivered on February 14th, 2024, as part of a national leadership seminar in Florida. You can find this full lecture at Hillsdale's Freedom Library. That's freedomlibrary.hillsdale.edu. Former Speaker Gingrich begins by telling us the problems inside the Department of Justice are not just surface-level issues.
The question which Hillsdale College asked me to talk about, what to do about the Justice Department, is actually part of a much bigger question. How do we decisively take power from a deeply entrenched radical elite that controls the commanding heights, to use Lenin's term? Scott Rasmussen, who I recommend highly if you haven't looked at it, has done a brilliant study. He figured out that there's a 1% of the elite, Harvard, Princeton, Yale, etc., and he has three things. You have to graduate from those schools with a graduate degree, not just go to school, graduate degree, earn $150,000 or more as a family, and live in a big city. And if you're in that group, you are so radically different from the rest of us that it's astounding. In fact, Scott makes the point that, for example, when asked the question, would you be willing to steal an election rather than lose it? 7% of the American people say yes. 67% of the elites say yes, which he said in his entire career of polling, is the most frightening single figure he ever saw. And when you go through all of their values, they are so far to the left of the rest of us and so willing to use their power to impose it. Remember, these are the people who run the government, the people who run the news media, the people who run the universities, and increasingly, the people who run the largest corporations. It was captured beyond Rasmussen by Charles Murray in a remarkable book called Coming Apart, in which Murray simply went and looked at zip codes and reported that if you went to Harvard, Princeton, Yale, etc., you married people who went to Harvard, Princeton, Yale, etc., you lived in a zip code with people who are from Harvard, Princeton, Yale, etc. These are the people who want to run the rest of us, and it's very clear, both in the Rasmussen study and in Charles Murray's book. These people believe they are our superiors, that it is their duty and their moral right to dictate to the rest of us.
Gingrich continues by giving us an example from the past to examine the scope of the current problem.
Lincoln, to give you a sense of scale, Abraham Lincoln comes into office, replaces 3/4 of the federal employees. 3/4. Every postmaster, every customs officer, and puts into those places people loyal to him. It's probably the key to how he sustains the Union through 4 years of bitter, painful civil war. Today, because of the growth of the civil service system, the civil service is permanent. And unless we're prepared to go into office and fundamentally change that fact and return the government to the people, we don't currently have government of the people, by the people, and for the people, to quote Lincoln. We have government of the elites, by the elites, and for the elites. And the rest of us are allowed to complain. Now, if you want to change that, you have to be prepared for very dramatic and very deep changes. And that means that if the election of 24 works out, you're going to have conflict in 25, 26, 27, 28, and maybe another 8 or 10 years. Remember, this system began to grow up under Franklin Delano Roosevelt 89 years ago. So this thing has been growing for almost 9 decades. By the way, that's longer than Lincoln's described 7 in the Gettysburg Address. And what kind of folks are they? And it's not that they're evil, although a few of them have evil intent, but it is that they are totally, sincerely committed to the belief that you and I are stupid and that they have an obligation to govern us and to change us in ways that are appropriate. Now, to change that, I think, is an enormous problem. And I would just say to you that Lincoln understood, if you truly believe in government by the people, then you have to believe in government by the people. And the rise, starting with, in many ways, with Woodrow Wilson's works in the late 19th century. Wilson was an academic who was absolutely committed to the progressive idea that there are a small, select group of experts. They have to understand the depth, the sincerity. These are not hypocritical people. These are totally sincere totalitarians who believe that if only you would relax, your life would become better because they are so much smarter and better trained than you are.
We're listening to excerpts from a lecture given by former House Speaker Newt Gingrich at a Hillsdale National Leadership Seminar in February of 2024. Gingrich continues by looking at specific problems in the Department of Justice and also in the Department of Education.
And this has been growing. I've done a whole series at the American Spectator, starting in 1960, on the growth of where we have, how have we gotten this far off track? And the reason is that there is a core group of beliefs assimilated by more and more people, largely in the academy, and then transmitted through the news media, through politicians, through the bureaucracy, that are just insane. So if you go back and think about it, in the 1960s, the Department of Justice became a centerpiece for left-wing liberal lawyers who were going to break segregation in the South. Now, I happen to believe, as a guy born in Pennsylvania who grew up in an integrated U.S. Army and who experienced segregation as a young person when my dad was stationed in Georgia, I happen to believe ending segregation was morally and historically totally correct. On the other hand, those people who had decided how smart they were and how dumb we were then just shifted gears. So the Department of Justice from the 1960s on was filled with people who felt that they had the right and the moral duty to impose on the rest of us. You see the same thing at the Environmental Protection Agency. The people who are naturally attracted there believe that Mother Earth matters and you don't. So if we have to reduce the human race to 12 people with clubs trying not to get eaten by lions, that's the price of saving, civilization, or saving the planet. Gaia, the Mother Earth, matters far more than we mere humans. Similarly, if you were to, in fact, look at the Department of Education, it is filled with people who believe that the inability to do math and the inability to read and write is far less important than feeling good socially. And so they want you to have a sense of not being bullied and not being inappropriately oppressed and never failing, because failing is such a bad feeling, that we should actually have schools like in Baltimore, where there are 5 high schools in which not a single student can pass math. Not one out of 5 high schools.
Finally, some concluding remarks from former Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich in his address, What to Do About the DOJ.
The system is corrupt on a scale that is, frankly, I think, very hard to imagine. I think you have to look at the Mueller report, the Durbin report, for that matter, Robert Hur's report, and realize that you are dealing right now with a crisis of the survival of the American system, because the center of using state power, which is the whole Justice Department and the FBI and the courts, the whole system has been corrupted. And until we're prepared to fundamentally, profoundly change, and for example, I would suggest something as bold as the jury pool for the District of Columbia should be the entire country. So you want to pick somebody from Idaho, fine. But you should never, ever again tolerate having the kind of totally rigged, totally hypocritical system that we currently have. And I do believe that we are, and I agree totally with President Arnn. This is, and I've written novels about this. I believe if you combine our foreign adversaries, the decay of our domestic bureaucracies, and the nature of the people who want to radically change us, take those three things, I believe we are in the gravest danger we have been in since Washington crossed the Delaware on Christmas night. And I think that should sober every American.
We've been listening to excerpts from former House Speaker Newt Gingrich and his lecture, What to Do About the DOJ, from Hillsdale College's National Leadership Seminar in February of 2024 in Florida. You can find this full lecture at freedomlibrary.hillsdale.edu. That will wrap up this edition of the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. Our thanks to Victor Davis Hanson, his book The Case for Trump, now re-released and updated in paperback. And former House Speaker Newt Gingrich, we heard excerpts from his Hillsdale lecture from earlier this year. Remember, you can hear new episodes every week on this station. You also can find extended versions of some of our interviews or listen anytime to the podcast. Find it at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you get your audio. Until next week, I'm Scot Bertram, and this has been the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.